2. The total war economy.
全面战时经济，
The future is in the past.
未来在过去。
The defeat of 1945 is often regarded as a watershed that heralded the beginning of a new Japan. The dark past was left behind, and a fresh start was made with new institutions and economic structures, set up from scratch under the guiding hand of the U.S. occupation. The pictures of burned-down cities, destroyed factories, and ruined bridges sometimes give the impression that a new era started in the ashes of August 1945. The U.S. occupation, officially in charge until 1952, longer than in Germany, implemented the U.S. program of re-education and democratization of the Japanese people. It provided Japan with a new constitution, political parties, free elections also for women, and a market-oriented capitalist economic system. MacArthur's reforms allowed labor unions, broke up the zaibatsu, and introduced sweeping land reforms.
1945年的失败常被视为一个分水岭，预示着新日本的开始。黑暗的过去被抛在了脑后，新的机构和经济结构从零开始，在美国占领下的指导下开始新的起点。被烧毁的城市、被摧毁的工厂和被毁坏的桥梁的图片，有时给人一种印象，即新的时代始于1945年8月的灰烬。美国占领直到1952年官方负责，比在德国更长，实施了美国对日本人民的再教育和民主化的计划。它为日本提供了新的宪法、政党，包括妇女在内的自由选举，以及市场导向的资本主义经济体系。麦克阿瑟的改革允许劳工联盟，打破了财阀，引入了大规模的土地改革。
Many books and especially popular accounts of Japan therefore start their analysis in 1945, and Japanese history is usually divided into the neat segments of post-war and pre-war. Not all scholars look at it this way, as the division into post-war and pre-war periods leaves out the most important period in Japanese history this century. Wartime. Point 1 for it is during the war that virtually all of the characteristics of the Japanese social, economic, and even political system of the post-war era, all that we call typically Japanese, were formed.
因此，许多书籍，尤其是关于日本的流行描述，通常从1945年开始分析。日本历史通常被划分为战后和战前的整齐段落，并非所有的学者都这样看待，因为将战后和战前划分为两个时期，忽略了本世纪日本历史上最重要的时期——战时。因为正是在战争期间，几乎所有我们称之为典型日本的日本社会、经济甚至政治体系的特征，都在战后时代形成。
Post-war sales drives and inroads into world markets by Japanese companies have often been likened to military campaigns. The employees of Japanese companies call themselves senshi, soldiers, and their well-known lifestyle is comparable to that of troops in an army. However, the characterization of Japan's post-war economic system as a war economy is not meant metaphorically. It is literally true. Japan's post-war economy is a fully mobilized war economy, with production shifted from weapons to consumer products.
战后日本公司的销售推动和对世界市场的进军经常被比作军事行动。日本公司的员工自称为战士，他们的生活方式与军队中的士兵相似。然而，将日本的战后经济体系描述为战争经济并不是比喻，这是字面上的真实。日本的战后经济是一个完全动员的战争经济，生产从武器转向消费品。
Guess the free market economy.
猜测自由市场经济。
The reader is asked to guess which country is described by the following facts. It is a country characterized by virtually unmitigated capitalism. The stock market is the main source of external funding for companies in this country. Shareholders are all-powerful and demand high dividends. This forces management to be oriented toward short-term profits. Most managers are appointed from the outside, not from the ranks of the company. Fierce takeover battles and corporate buyouts keep management on their toes. If they don't perform, they could be out of a job in no time.
读者被要求猜测以下事实描述的是哪个国家。这是一个几乎没有缓解的资本主义特征的国家。股票市场是这个国家公司外部融资的主要来源。股东拥有至高无上的权利，要求高额的股息。这迫使管理层以短期利润为导向。大多数经理是从外部任命的，而不是从公司内部提拔的。激烈的收购战和公司收购使管理层保持警惕。如果他们表现不佳， 他们可能会在短时间内失去工作。
The labor market in this country is characterized by hiring and firing and a high rate of job switching by employees. Income and wealth differentials are large. A whole class of rich capitalist families lives off their dividend income. The overall savings rate is low and consumption constitutes the biggest part of GDP, about 80%. There are few government regulations, and government officials exert little direct influence over the economy. Indeed, bureaucrats have to do as politicians tell them. There are fierce disputes over policy issues and public interest in politics is high, at times even passionate.
这个国家的劳动市场特点是雇佣和解雇频繁，员工的工作变动率高，收入和财富差距很大。一整个富裕的资本家家庭靠他们的股息收入生活。总体储蓄率低，消费构成了 GDP 的最大部分，约 80%。政府规定很少，政府官员对经济影响力小。实际上，官僚们必须按照政治家的指示行事。政策问题存在激烈的争议，公众对政治的兴趣很高，有时甚至充满激情。
It would be natural to identify the country in question as the present-day United States. The description fits that country fairly well. However, the country referred to as Japan, the Japan of the early 1920s. Many observers believe that the typical, Japanese-style economic system has been around since before this century and has its roots in age-old Japanese culture. But scholars have by now established as fact that, to the contrary, the Japanese-style economic system that we know hardly existed in the 1920s.
人们很自然地会认为这个国家是现在的美国，这个描述相当适合这个国家。然而，这里指的是日本1920年代初的日本。许多观察家认为，典型的日本式经济体系自上个世纪以前就已经存在，并且根植于古老的日本文化。但是，学者们现在已经确立了一个事实，即我们所知道的日本式经济体系在1920年代几乎不存在。
Japan in the 1920s, hotbed of free market capitalism.
1920年代的日本，自由市场资本主义的温床。
In the 1920s, in many ways Japan was a different country from the one we have known since the post-war era. Its economic system was not pure free market capitalism, but it was much closer to this ideal than it has been ever since. Point 2 Neither lifetime employment, a seniority-based wage and bonus system, nor company unions were widespread. Firms had few scruples about rapid hiring and firing. Neither did employees have any qualms about quitting to seek greener pastures. Japanese employees changed jobs as much as U.S. employees do now, a figure 3 times as high as in the Japan of the 1980s. Unions were organized by trade, not by company, thus providing employees with a better voice to call for pay raises, something that became effectively impossible with the company union system of the post-war era. Influential labor unions organized many seriously disruptive strikes in the 1920s, something unheard of in post-war Japan. The unemployment rate was not 2%, as during much of the post-war era, but in the double digits.
在许多方面，1920年代的日本与我们自战后以来所熟知的日本是一个完全不同的国家。它的经济体系并非纯粹的自由市场资本主义，但比以后任何时候都更接近这个理想。终身雇佣、基于资历的工资和奖金制度，公司工会都不普遍。公司对快速雇佣和解雇毫无顾忌。员工也不会因为寻找更好的机会而辞职。日本员工的工作变动率与现在的美国员工一样高，这个数字是1980年代日本的3倍。工会是按行业组织的，而不是按公司，这为员工提供了更好的机会来要求加薪，这在战后的公司工会制度中几乎是不可能的。有影响力的工会在1920年代组织了许多严重破坏性的罢工，这在战后的日本是闻所未闻的。失业率不是 2%， 如同战后的大部分时期，而是2位数。
Firms were not majority owned by other companies, as in the post-war system of cross-shareholding. In the 1920s, there were real capitalists, individuals and families, holding substantial portions of stock. Individual share ownership accounted for the large majority of all shareholdings. While by the early 1990s it had fallen to less than 15%. Point 3 It was natural that the shareholders would be directly represented on the company board and have their voices heard in the determination of company policy. Before the war, the majority of directors on the boards of large companies were outside appointees, put in place by the shareholders. By contrast, in 1990, over 90% of directors on the boards of large firms were internal appointees, raised from the management of the firm. Point 4.
公司并非由其他公司持有大部分股份，如同战后的交叉持股制度。在1920年代，有真正的资本家、个人和家庭持有大量的股份，个人股权占所有股权的大多数，而到了1990年代初，这一比例已经下降到不到15%。股东在公司董事会上直接代表并发出他们的声音，参与公司政策的决定是很自然的事情。在战前，大公司董事会的大多数董事是外部任命的，由股东安排。相比之下，到了1990年，大公司董事会的90%以上的董事都是内部任命的，由公司管理层提拔。
Back in the 1920s or 1930s, shareholders were powerful because companies obtained between 30 and 50% of their external funding from the stock market. In the post-war era, such as the 1960s and 1970s, fundraising from the stock market accounted for merely 5 to 10% of total external fundraising. 5. The shareholders in the 1920s used their influence to demand high dividends. This required the firms to pay out as much of the profits as possible. 6.
在1920年代或1930年代，股东们因为公司从股市获得了30%到50%的外部资金而变得强大。在战后时期，如1960年代和1970年代，从股市筹集的资金仅占总外部筹资的5%到10%。1920年代的股东利用他们的影响力要求高额的股息，这要求公司尽可能多地支付利润。
Going for profits, not market share.
追求利润而非市场份额。
In the 1920s and early 1930s, more than two-thirds of profits among leading Japanese companies were paid out as dividends. A sizable 6% were paid out as directors' bonuses, and only 25% were kept as reserves. 7. By contrast, in the period from 1966 to 1970, 43% of profits were paid out as dividends, only 2% as directors' bonuses, and a massive 55% was reinvested. 8. In other words, before the war, the distribution of profits was heavily skewed in favor of the capitalist owners. Dividends reflected the fortune of the firm and thus fluctuated with it, unlike the low, virtually fixed dividends of the post-war era.
在1920年代和1930年初，日本领先公司中超过2/3的利润被作为股息分发，有6%的利润被作为董事奖金支付，只有25%的利润被保留作为储备。相比之下，在1966年到1970年期间，43%的利润被作为股息分发，只有2%的利润被作为董事奖金支付，而高达55%的利润被再投资。换句话说，在战前，利润的分配严重偏向资本家所有者。股息反映了公司的财富，因此会随之波动，这与战后低且几乎固定的股息不同。
If management did not implement the owner's orders, they would quickly be sacked and replaced by a new team. This was quite in contrast to post-war Japan, where annual general meetings were rubber stamp affairs that approved management in a matter of minutes, without discussions or questions being raised. A reason why the Sakaya racketeers could make a living simply by threatening to ask questions at shareholders' meetings. 9. Today's salarymen consider the firm their own, not the property of shareholders, and feel justified to run it as they see fit, without explanations to shareholders.
如果管理层不执行所有者的命令，他们会很快被解雇并被新团队取代。这与战后的日本形成了鲜明的对比。那时的年度股东大会只是走过场的事情，只需几分钟就能批准管理层，而不需要进行讨论或提问。这就是为什么索赔者只需威胁在股东会上提问就能谋生。今天的上班族认为公司是他们自己的，而不是股东的财产。他们认为有权按照自己的方式运营公司，无需向股东解释。
While in post-war Japan income and wealth were highly equalized, in the 1920s there were significant disparities, with many affluent owners of real estate and stocks who lived off dividends and rents. An important part of this capitalist class were the families that owned the main zaibatsu through their control of the holding companies that concentrated shares. But there were others. Only 10 of the 60 largest mining and manufacturing firms were related to the zaibatsu. 10. The majority of firms were non-zaibatsu, and they had diffused share ownership.
虽然在战后的日本收入和财富高度平等，但在1920年代存在着显著的差距，许多富裕的房地产和股票所有者靠股息和租金过活。这个资本家阶级的重要部分是那些通过控制集中股份的控股公司拥有主要财阀的家族，但还有其他人。在最大的60家采矿和制造公司中，只有10家与财阀有关。大多数公司都不是财阀公司，他们的股份分散。
The zaibatsu firms were keen to expand their influence, however. They aggressively bought up other firms in stock acquisitions and takeovers, a practice unheard of in most of the post-war era. Often rival zaibatsu would engage each other in hostile takeover battles. In the 1930s, the Mitsui Group bought Meiji Sugar from the Mitsubishi Group and 2 Toyo sugar factories from the Suzuki Group. Aji Paper took over management of Fuji Paper, although it was part of the competing Mitsui Zaibatsu.
然而，财阀公司热衷于扩大他们的影响力。他们积极地通过股票收购和收购其他公司，这在战后的大部分时间里都是闻所未闻的。财阀之间经常会进行敌对收购的战斗。在1930年代，三井集团从三菱集团购买了明治糖业，从铃木集团购买了2家东洋糖厂。王子纸业接管了富士纸业的管理，尽管它是竞争对手三井财阀的一部分。
The contrast between pre-war and post-war Japan is also reflected in savings rates and the consumption share of GDP. While consumption today makes up less than 60% of GDP, in the 1920s it accounted for about 80%, as much as in the United States today. Likewise, the percentage of income that is saved, currently running at about 20%, was only about 5% before the war. Strong consumption sucked in many imports of final consumption goods, which was not the case in the post-war decades.
战前和战后日本之间的对比也反映在储蓄率和 GDP 消费份额上。虽然现在的消费占 GDP 的比例不到 60%， 但在1920年代，它占了大约80%，与今天的美国一样多。同样，目前的储蓄收入比例大约为 20%， 而在战前只有大约 5%。强劲的消费吸引了许多最终消费品的进口，这在战后几十年并未发生。
The reform bureaucrats of the 1930s criticized Japan for looking just like the stereotyped view of American firms in the present time. 11 had U.S. trade negotiators been transported from the 1980s to the 1920s. They would not have demanded that Japan change to become more like the United States, for it resembled modern-day U.S.-style capitalism.
1930年代的改革官僚批评日本，看起来就像现在对美国公司的刻板印象。如果美国的贸易谈判代表从1980年代被送到1920年代，他们不会要求日本改变，变得更像美国，因为它类似于现代美式资本主义。
The crisis that changed Japan.
改变日本的危机。
Japanese-style capitalism does not go back to Japan's mystical past and peculiar Asian values. Compared to the well-known post-war version, it barely existed in embryonic form in the pre-war era. But when and how was Japan so fundamentally transformed from a fairly free market economy to the highly regulated post-war system? The answer must be found in the event that happened between the pre-war and post-war eras, the war itself.
日本式资本主义并非源于日本的神秘过去和特殊的亚洲价值观。与众所周知的战后版本相比，它在战前时代几乎只是以胚胎形式存在。但是，日本何时以及如何从一个相当自由的市场经济体根本性地转变为高度管制的战后体系呢？答案必须在战前和战后时代之间发生的事件中寻找。战争本身。
History teaches that no country changes fundamentally without a crisis. The 1930s and early 1940s were such a period. Until the early 1930s, the paradigm that had prevailed outside communist countries was that of liberal free market capitalism without much government interference. In Japan, there had been a strong tradition of government intervention, but by the early 1920s, the arguments of free market capitalism had become influential. There was also considerable external pressure from the United States for Japan to liberalize. 12 However, in the 1930s, the intellectual tide in Japan was changing back to the idea of government intervention. Because the free market system did not seem to deliver, the fallout from the New York stock market crash of 1929 was borderless. Worldwide, distressed banks withdrew their loans, bankrupting large proportions of the corporate sector and choking off demand, which led to deflation and large-scale unemployment. 13 This cast doubt on the capitalist paradigm. Quite apparently, free markets, left to their own devices, could also produce major economic disasters.
历史教导我们，没有危机，任何国家都不会发生根本性的变化。1930年代和1940年代初就是这样一个时期。直到1930年代初，除共产主义国家外，其他地方普遍存在的范式是自由市场资本主义，政府干预不多。在日本，政府干预的传统很强，但到了1920年代初，自由市场资本主义的论点已经变得有影响力。美国也对日本进行了相当大的外部压力，要求其自由化。然而，在1930年代，日本的知识潮流正在回归政府干预的理念，因为自由市场体系似乎无法提供。1929年纽约股市崩盘的影响是无国界的，全球范围内陷入困境的银行撤回了他们的贷款，导致大部分企业破产，需求被扼杀，从而导致通货紧缩和大规模失业。这对资本主义范式产生了怀疑。显然，任由自由市场自行运作也可能产生重大的经济灾难。
As economies shrank, 13% in the United States, 23% in the United Kingdom, 14-12% in Germany, and 9.6% in Japan. 15 Poverty became widespread. 16 The scale of deprivation is hard to imagine today. Starvation and selling of children into prostitution occurred in the United States, Germany, and Japan. A countrywide survey conducted by the military in Japan in the early 1930s found that a high percentage of young men were physically unfit for military service due to malnutrition, disease, and job-induced disabilities. Meanwhile, the capitalist fat cats continued to live in style. The Japanese elite saw that both military capability and the workforce would be severely affected if nothing was done.
随着经济萎缩，美国13%，英国23%，14%德国12%，日本9.6%。15贫困变得普遍。16今天很难想象当时的贫困程度。在美国、德国和日本都发生了饥荒和将孩子卖入妓院的情况。日本军方在1930年代初进行的全国调查发现，由于营养不良、疾病和工作引发的残疾，有很高比例的年轻男性身体不适合服兵役。与此同时，资本主义的肥猫们继续过着奢华的生活。日本精英看到，如果什么都不做，军事能力和劳动力都会受到严重影响。
Not fully comprehending the causes of the Great Depression, more and more thinkers and policymakers concluded that the capitalist system itself was at fault. Sitting idly on one's hands, as free market orthodoxy prescribed, was getting increasingly risky. It was the stuff revolutions were made of. The Bolshevik takeover of 1917, facilitated by dire economic straits and public discontent, was still fresh in everybody's memory.
对大萧条原因的理解不足，越来越多的思想家和政策制定者得出结论：资本主义系统本身有问题。按照自由市场的教条坐视不管的风险越来越大，这是革命的导火索。1917年布尔什维克的夺权是由于严重的经济困境和公众不满，这仍然鲜活在每个人的记忆中。
Internal and external threats.
内部和外部威胁。
In Japan, the ruling elite and the bureaucracy became more worried about the possibility of a communist revolution. At the same time, a crisis loomed outside Japan's borders. As the Great Depression spread, countries engaged in competitive devaluation and trade wars to increase demand and income at home. As a result, prices were driven down further, heightening deflation. So more and more countries began to close themselves off from free trade, introducing quotas and tariffs. This was potentially disastrous, for, as a country with hardly any raw material resources, Japan had trade as its lifeblood. If it was not self-sufficient in food, it could survive only if it imported raw materials, processed them, and sold the value-added products abroad.
在日本，统治精英和官僚越来越担心共产主义革命的可能性。与此同时，日本国境之外的危机正在逼近。随着大萧条的蔓延，各国开始进行竞争性贬值和贸易战，以增加国内的需求和收入。结果导致价格进一步下跌，加剧了通货紧缩。因此，越来越多的国家开始封闭自由贸易， 引入配额和关税。这对日本来说可能是灾难性的，因为作为一个几乎没有任何原材料资源的国家，日本的生命线就是贸易。如果它在食物上不能自给自足，那么它只能通过进口原材料加工它们，并将增值产品卖到国外来生存。
Japan's economy was crucially dependent on energy imports, mainly of coal and oil. These came largely across the Pacific from the United States. However, the United States had begun to turn protectionist and was fending off Japanese exports. It also increasingly disapproved of Japan's colonial ambitions in Asia.
日本的经济严重依赖能源进口，主要是煤炭和石油，这些主要来自太平洋对岸的美国。然而，美国已经开始转向保护主义，抵制日本的出口。他也越来越不赞成日本在亚洲的殖民野心。
The quest for autarky.
寻求自给自足。
Japan ignored U.S. critique. After all, the United Kingdom and the United States had so far been the colonial aggressors in Asia, together with France and Holland. Japan's leaders, especially in the army, had examined closely how Germany was starved of raw material and food imports during the trade blockade of World War I. They concluded that as long as Japan was dependent on imports from the white man, it was not free. With the internal threats of recession, unemployment, and communist takeover and the external threat of being cut off from world trade, the military concluded that Japan could survive in such a hostile world only if it was strong and free from blackmail. That meant a strong and autarkic economy. Point 17.
日本无视美国的批评，毕竟到目前为止，英国和美国一直是亚洲的殖民侵略者，与法国和荷兰一起。日本的领导人，特别是军队，仔细研究了一战期间贸易封锁如何使德国的原材料和食品进口短缺。他们得出的结论是，只要日本依赖于白人的进口，它就不是自由的。面对经济衰退、失业和共产主义接管的内部威胁，以及被切断与世界贸易的外部威胁，军队得出的结论是，日本只有在强大且不受威胁的情况下，才能在如此敌对的世界中生存。这意味着需要一个强大且自给自足的经济体。
Externally, the military began to implement the dream of Asia for the Asians. When they advanced beyond Manchuria into China in their quest for autarky, indications that the United States might play the trade boycott card merely confirmed their suspicions, and they accelerated the implementation of their plans.
在外部，军队开始实施亚洲属于亚洲人的梦想。当他们在寻求自给自足的过程中超越满洲进入中国，美国可能打出贸易抵制牌的迹象，只是证实了他们的猜疑。他们加快了计划的实施。
Internally, they worked on dismantling the system of classical laissez-faire economics, which Japan had tried but found wanting. It was time to try something else. Military thinkers and reform-minded bureaucrats in Japan noticed that economists in Germany were offering a different prescription. Under the Nazi administration, their counsel bore fruit. Indeed, to quote British economist Joan Robinson, Hitler had already found how to cure unemployment before Keynes had finished explaining why it occurred. 18. Moreover, Japanese bureaucrats noticed that one major country had escaped the Great Depression altogether, the Soviet Union. In the 1930s, it embarked on a frantic government-led industrialization drive that was admired in many capitalist countries.
在内部，他们致力于拆解日本曾尝试但发现不尽如人意的古典自由放任经济体系。是时候尝试一些新的东西了。日本的军事思想家和改革派官僚注意到，德国的经济学家正在提供一种不同的处方。在纳粹政权下，他们的建议取得了成果。确实，正如英国经济学家琼·罗宾逊所说，希特勒已经找到了如何治疗失业的方法，而凯恩斯还在解释为什么会发生失业。此外，日本的官僚们注意到，有一个主要国家完全逃脱了大萧条——苏联。在20世纪30年代，苏联开始了一场许多资本主义国家都钦佩的疯狂的政府主导的工业化驱动。
Reform bureaucrats pushed for a new system.
改革派官僚推动新体系的建立。
In Japan, the move away from the free market economy was spearheaded by the military and the reform bureaucrats, who had entered the ministries during times of high unemployment and had often witnessed starvation in the countryside. They were sympathetic to the critique by Japanese thinkers, such as Kamekichi Takahashi and German economists, who censured the free market system for allowing rich shareholders to pursue profits while unemployment was endemic. 19 The capitalist shareholders often squeezed firms just to raise their dividends. As funds were drained, firms had little to reinvest. Managers were thus often unable to act in the interest of longer-term profitability and survival. Meanwhile, large-scale stock owners often engaged in speculation, driving up share prices and then dumping the stocks for the capital gain, rendering the stock market little more than a rigged casino.
在日本，军队和改革派官僚带头远离自由市场经济，他们在高失业率时期进入各部门，经常在农村目睹饥荒。他们对日本思想家如高桥圭吉和德国经济学家的批评表示同情。他们谴责自由市场体系允许富有的股东在失业疫病流行时追求利润。19资本家股东经常压榨公司以提高他们的股息。由于资金被抽走，公司几乎没有什么可以再投资的，因此经理们往往无法为了长期的盈利性和生存而行动。同时，大规模的股东经常参与投机，推高股票价格，然后为了资本收益而抛售股票，使得股市变得不过是一个被操纵的赌场。
To the military, the equation was simple. To be strong, Japan's economy needed to grow fast. To increase growth, all resources had to be mobilized, ending the waste of unemployment. The reform bureaucrats also did not want to wait for Adam Smith's invisible hand. They felt it had to be their quite visible hands that would strengthen Japan's economy. They urged government controls, thus they were often also called control bureaucrats.
对军队来说，这个等式很简单，要强大，日本的经济需要快速增长。为了增加增长，所有资源都必须被动员起来，结束失业的浪费。改革派官僚也不想等待亚当·斯密的看不见的手，他们觉得必须是他们非常明显的手来强化日本的经济。他们敦促政府进行控制，因此他们经常被称为控制派官僚。
Their desire for controls did not imply micromanagement as in a Soviet-style planned economy. Their ideas were strongly influenced by anti-capitalist and especially National Socialist thought from Germany, which placed emphasis on government intervention in the form of redesigning the incentive structures. 20 Thus it happened that by the early 1930s Japan had already started to embark on a mobilized war economy. The reformers met resistance on the way, so what we describe as the mobilized war economy was completed only toward the end of the war or even, in many ways, during the early post-war period. 21
他们对控制的渴望并不意味着像苏联式的计划经济那样的微观管理。他们的想法受到了反资本主义和特别是来自德国的国家社会主义思想的强烈影响。这些思想强调政府以重新设计激励结构的形式进行干预。因此，到了20世纪30年代初，日本已经开始投入到动员战争经济中。改革者在途中遇到了阻力，所以我们所描述的动员战争经济只是在战争结束或者在许多方面是在战后初期才完成的。21
When hostilities with China turned into full-scale war in 1937, the military pushed through major changes under the cover of emergency war legislation, which gave the reform bureaucrats the mandate to establish a mobilized economy with strong government intervention. A new economic, industrial, social, and political structure began to emerge. When the hostilities turned into World War, even stronger legislation was used to completely reshape the Japanese economic, social, and political system. The redesigned institutional setup was to ensure that managers and employees would work toward greater output, not for the sake of short-term profits. It was a transformation that created the post-war Japanese miracle economy.
当1937年与中国的敌对行动升级为全面战争时，军队在紧急战争立法的掩护下推动了重大变革，这给了改革派官僚建立一个强大政府干预的动员经济的授权。新的经济、工业、社会和政治结构开始出现。当敌对行动升级为世界大战时，更强大的立法被用来彻底重塑日本的经济、社会和政治体系。重新设计的制度安排是为了确保经理和员工会为了提高产出而工作，而不是为了短期利润。这是一个创造了战后日本奇迹经济的转变。
The militarization of Japan.
日本的军事化。
In 1936, the Hirota cabinet agreed to put the economy on a quasi-war footing. The first step was to boost the budget for military expenditure. As companies in the munitions sector watched the formation of the 1937 budget, they realized that substantial amounts of raw material imports were required to increase military production. A speculative import boom of raw materials ensued, throwing the balance of payments into sizable deficit. The 1932 foreign exchange control laws were used to restrict imports. They had represented the first set of reforms that would eventually create a controlled war economy. 22.
1936年，广田内阁同意将经济置于准战争状态，首步是增加军事开支的预算。当军火行业的公司们在观察1937年的预算制定过程中，他们意识到需要大量的原材料进口以增加军事生产。随后，原材料的投机性进口热潮席卷而来，使得支付平衡出现了巨大的赤字。1932年的外汇管制法被用来限制进口，这些法律代表了最初的一套改革，最终将创建一个受控的战争经济。22.
The 1937 pro-military cabinet of Kono, the grandfather of 1993 Prime Minister Hosokawa, promulgated 3 wartime control laws. The Export-Import Commodities Emergency Measures Law ordered priority allocation of critical materials to the munitions industry. The Emergency Capital Allocation Law controlled the establishment of companies, capital increases, dividend payments, bond flotations, and borrowing of funds. It was used to channel money to the munitions industry according to priority. The Munitions Industrial Mobilization Law furnished bureaucrats with further powers of control.
1937年，亲军政府的近卫内阁1993年首相细川的祖父颁布了3项战时控制法。出口进口商品紧急措施法令对关键材料进行了优先分配给军火工业。紧急资本配置法控制了公司的设立、资本增加、股息支付、债券发行和资金借贷。它被用来按优先级将资金引导到军火工业。军火工业动员法赋予了官僚们更多的控制权。
In April 1938, the sweeping National General Mobilization Law was put to the Diet. It allowed the mobilization of all physical things in the country, and it stated that the government may in time of war, including incidents that are to be treated as war, draft imperial subjects and employ them in mobilization work as stipulated by imperial decree whenever necessary. It was pushed through by Kono against vigorous resistance from politicians and business leaders, who realized it was a carte blanche. It did not specify the particulars of controls. 23. The principle of a general law that leaves the details to be filled in later by ministerial ordinances gave all authority to the government bureaucracy that could freely wield it as it saw fit. The law gave the government the power to determine prices, establish controls over production, distribution, consumption, movement of goods, and foreign trade, and to set up control agencies to implement the decrees. 24.
1938年4月，全面的国家总动员法被提交给国会。它允许动员国内的所有物质，规定政府在战争时期，包括被视为战争的事件，可以在必要时征召皇民，并让他们参与动员工作，如皇家法令所规定。这项法律在政治家和商业领袖的激烈反对下被近卫强行通过。他们意识到这是一张白纸条，它并未具体规定控制的细节。23. 这种一般法的原则将细节留给后来的部长条例来填补，将所有权力交给了可以自由行使权力的政府官僚。这项法律赋予了政府决定价格、建立生产、分配、消费、货物流动和外贸的控制，并设立控制机构来执行法令的权利。24.
System for maximum production.
最大生产系统。
With such legal powers in their hands, and with the approach of Japan's entry into World War II, the Kono cabinet in 1940 proclaimed the new economic order, composed of a new financial system, a new fiscal policy, and a new labor system. Overall coordination lay in the hands of the Cabinet Planning Board, set up in October 1937. It was designed as the economic general staff of the militarized economy. Its job was to set up a new economic system that would deliver maximum economic growth and to direct resources toward the priority industries.
在这样的法律权力和日本即将参战的情况下，1940年的近卫内阁宣布了新经济秩序，包括新的金融系统、新的财政政策和新的劳动制度。整体协调由内阁计划委员会负责，该委员会于1937年10月成立。它被设计为军事化经济的经济总参谋部。 其任务是建立一个能够实现最大经济增长的新经济系统，并将资源引向优先产业。
The aim of the structural transformation was to develop an institutional framework that changed incentives such that everybody would be striving toward the goal of maximum output growth. Economic growth is achieved when some resources are saved and invested. The more is invested, the faster the economy will grow and the greater national income will become. A farmer starting out with nothing but a bag of rice seeds faces the choice between saving and consuming. If he maximizes current consumption, he can have a feast this year, but will starve the next. The more he saves and replants, invests, the greater the crop in the future, as each plant delivers more than 100 grains of rice. The more he consumes, the less is left for replanting.
结构转型的目标是发展一个改变激励机制的制度框架，使得每个人都朝着最大产出增长的目标努力。当一部分资源被储存和投资时，经济增长就会实现。投资的越多，经济增长的速度就越快，国民收入也会越大。一个一无所有、只有一袋稻米种子的农民面临着储蓄和消费的选择。如果他最大化当前的消费，他今年可以大吃一顿，但明年就会挨饿。他储蓄和再种植、投资的越多，未来的收成就越大，因为每株植物可以产出超过100粒稻米。他消费的越多，留给再种植的就越少。
Firms are the farmers of the economy. They face the decision whether to save and reinvest their profits or to pay them out to the shareholders as dividends. The smaller the dividends and the more money reinvested, the faster the company will grow. To create an economy that grows rapidly, the institutions of the economy must be shaped such that individuals will save and firms will retain earnings and reinvest.
公司就是经济的农民，他们面临着是否要储蓄和再投资他们的利润，或者将利润作为股息分发给股东的决定。股息越少，再投资的钱越多，公司增长的速度就越快。为了创造一个快速增长的经济，经济的制度必须塑造成个人会储蓄、公司会保留收益并再投资的形式。
Separation of ownership from control.
所有权与控制权的分离。
There are three parties involved in the organization of firms: the owners, the managers, and the employees. In small, family-owned firms, all three roles may be played by the same person. This is what classical and neoclassical economics assumes, for its models consist of many small firms, run and owned by one individual. However, the rise of the large-scale corporation has driven a wedge between the three functions. Usually, large firms cannot be funded, hence owned, by one individual. They cannot be managed by one individual, and they employ a large number of workers.
在公司的组织中涉及到三方：所有者、经理和员工。在小型的家族企业中，这三个角色可能由同一个人扮演。这就是古典和新古典经济学的假设，因为它的模型由许多小公司组成，由一个人经营和拥有。然而，大型公司的崛起在这三个功能之间驱动了一个楔形。通常，大公司不能由一个人资助，因此不能由一个人拥有。他们不能由一个人管理，他们雇佣了大量的工人。
So the rise of the large corporation produced a separation of ownership from control and the detachment of employees from the goals of the firms. Each group has different aims and incentives. In a one-man firm, all the incentives of the three different functions coincide and the firm is pulling in the same direction. However, in large firms, as the three groups become separate units, each is striving for what is best from their viewpoint, and the firm begins to pull in different directions. The final outcome may not be what produces fastest economic growth. It may also not be what is best for society and the country.
因此，大公司的崛起导致了所有权与控制权的分离，以及员工与公司目标的脱钩。每个群体都有不同的目标和激励。在一人公司中，这三个不同功能的所有激励都一致，公司正在朝着同一个方向努力。然而，在大公司中，当这三个群体成为独立的单位时，每个群体都在为他们认为最好的事情努力，公司开始朝着不同的方向拉动。最终的结果可能不是最快的经济增长，它也可能不是对社会和国家最好的。
Shareholders versus growth.
股东与增长。
The goal of the shareholders is profit maximization. If they are mainly interested in high dividend payments, companies may be starved of funds to reinvest and hence may grow more slowly. This tends to create surplus funds that a small class of rich owners spend on more trivial pursuits than productive investment. Income inequality rises, speculation and production of wasteful goods increases. Economic growth slows. For the super-rich, consumption is a small percentage of their total income and wealth. 25 With high income and wealth inequality, consumption will be weaker than in an economy with an egalitarian distribution.
股东的目标是利润最大化。如果他们主要关注高额的股息支付，公司可能会因资金匮乏而无法再投资，从而增长速度可能会更慢。这倾向于创造出富裕的资金，一小部分富有的所有者将这些资金用于比生产性投资更琐碎的追求。收入不平等增加，投机和浪费性商品的生产增加，经济增长放缓。对于超级富豪来说，消费是他们总收入和财富的一小部分。25在收入和财富不平等较高的情况下，消费将比在平等分配的经济中弱。
If employees are not motivated to work hard, and if they squeeze higher wages and shorter working hours out of firms, it will also dampen profits and, if an economy-wide phenomenon, lower overall economic growth. So the reform bureaucrats concluded that giving too much power to either shareholders or employees was bad for growth.
如果员工没有积极工作的动力，如果他们从公司中挤出更高的工资和更短的工作时间，这也会降低利润。如果这是一个全经济范围的现象，也会降低整体经济增长。因此，改革官僚得出结论，给予股东或员工过多的权利对增长不利。
They found the story different for managers. Managers receive not only higher pay, but also greater prestige and power over corporate resources, including expense budgets, if they move up the hierarchy. Since the hierarchy is pyramid-shaped, with fewer people at the top, more at the bottom, more managers will be able to rise up the ranks if the firm grows. So the pursuit of their own goals leads managers to strive for faster growth of the firm. While the aims of shareholders and workers are not directly in line with fast overall economic growth, the goals of the managers are. 26.
他们发现，对于经理来说，情况有所不同。经理不仅获得更高的薪酬，而且如果他们在等级制度中上升，他们对公司资源，包括费用预算的权利和声望也会增加。由于等级制度呈金字塔形，顶部的人少，底部的人多。如果公司增长，更多的经理将能够上升。因此，追求他们自己的目标，使经理们努力寻求公司的更快增长。虽然股东和工人的目标并不直接符合快速的整体经济增长，但经理的目标是。26.
Capitalism without capitalists.
没有资本家的资本主义。
The new economic system aimed at setting the firm free from control of stockholders pursuing profit-making. 27 Disempowering shareholders and workers while empowering managers would boost growth, the war planners concluded in the 1930s. The managers of large-scale firms were their allies, shareholders, and unruly unionized workers their enemy. 28 Workers, though, could be won over if treated the right way. To curb worker discontent and communist agitators, employees had to identify closely with the firm, for instance, by having a greater say in company matters and through indoctrination with an ideology of the firm as family.
新经济体系旨在让公司摆脱追求利润的股东的控制。27削弱股东和工人的权利，同时增强经理的权利，将促进增长。这是20世纪30年代的战争策划者得出的结论。大型公司的经理是他们的盟友，股东和不守规矩的工会工人是他们的敌人。28然而，如果以正确的方式对待，工人可以被赢得过来。为了遏制工人的不满和共产主义煽动者，员工必须与公司紧密相连，例如在公司事务中有更大的发言权，并通过公司就是家庭的意识形态进行灌输。
However, shareholders would be difficult to reconcile with the overall goal of fast growth. Among the three interest groups, they were least crucial for growth. The reformers concluded that in a modern economy dominated by large-scale corporations, capitalism would work better without capitalists and instead with powerful managers.
然而，股东很难与快速增长的总体目标相协调。在这三个利益集团中，他们对增长的重要性最低。改革者得出结论，在一个由大型公司主导的现代经济中，没有资本家的资本主义会运作得更好， 而是有强大的经理。
Managerial capitalism in the firm is family.
经理资本主义与公司作为家庭。
Given such analysis, the reformers had their work cut out for them. Managers were elevated. This came naturally, since in large-scale organizations they are essentially private sector bureaucrats. Modern bureaucracy is modeled on the Prussian bureaucracy, which in turn was designed on the basis of the Prussian army. Naturally, the military looked at managers as private sector soldiers, and as controls strengthened, they were fully integrated into the military chain of command. In the end, it extended down to the worker, who was a corporate soldier.
鉴于这样的分析，改革者们面临着艰巨的任务。经理们的地位被提升，这是自然而然的，因为在大型组织中，他们本质上是私营部门的官僚。现代官僚制度是以普鲁士官僚制度为模型的，而普鲁士官僚制度则是以普鲁士军队为基础设计的。自然，军队将经理视为私营部门的士兵，随着控制的加强，他们被完全融入到军事指挥链中。最后，这一链条延伸到了工人，他们成为了公司的士兵。
The doctrine of the firm as an organic organization, binding employers and employees together and serving for the public benefit, was officially implemented in 1938, with the establishment of industrial patriotic societies in all companies. Joint meetings with management and employees were organized where workers could raise their concerns and participate in management decisions. At the same time, trade unions were abolished and all union activity channeled to the company level. This ensured that concessions to workers would not become too large to endanger fast growth of the firm.
1938年，将公司视为有机组织的理念正式实施，将雇主和雇员紧密联系在一起，为公众利益服务。所有公司都建立了工业爱国社团，组织了管理层和员工的联席会议，工人可以在会议上提出他们的关切，并参与管理决策。同时，工会被废除，所有的工会活动都被引导到公司层面。这确保了对工人的让步不会过大，以致危及公司的快速增长。
Meanwhile, the role of stockholders was cut down to size. The new labor system proclaimed in 1940 that the firm was not the property of the shareholders, but a communal organization composed of those who worked there. Army ministry bureaucrats argued it is necessary to transform stocks to interest-bearing securities, and the character of stockholders to recipients of such interest. In management, it is essential to consider first and foremost the people who work for the firm. In one way or another, management, technology, and labor all depend on the overall manipulation of people. This aspect of management is invariably more important than capital itself. 29 new laws set limits on dividend growth. Beginning in April 1939, firms with dividend rates of 10% or more, about two-thirds of large firms at the time, required a permit from the Ministry of Finance to increase their dividend rate. This made stock investments less attractive. Moreover, since the assassination of Mitsui chief Dan Takuma, the Zaibatsu families had increasingly been selling their shares to the public. This was not only in response to pressure from the military and bureaucrats, but also to mitigate the anti-Zaibatsu feelings among the public.
与此同时，股东的角色被削弱。1940年宣布的新劳动制度宣称，公司不是股东的财产，而是由在那里工作的人组成的公共组织。军事部门的官僚们辩称，有必要将股票转化为利息证券，将股东的性质转变为这种利息的接收者。在管理中，首要考虑的是为公司工作的人。无论如何，管理、技术和劳动都依赖于对人的全面操控。这方面的管理无疑比资本本身更重要。新的法律对股息增长设定了限制。从1939年4月开始，股息率达到 10% 或更高的公司，当时约有2/3的大公司需要从财政部获得许可才能提高他们的股息率，这使得股票投资变得不那么吸引人。此外，自从三井总裁丹拓真被暗杀以来，财阀家族越来越多地将他们的股份出售给公众。这不仅是为了应对军方和官僚的压力，也是为了缓解公众对财阀的反感情绪。
It was soon found that if firms within a group issued shares and simply swapped them among each other, the influence of outside stockholders could be reduced without diluting group ties. Thus, cross-shareholdings rose in the 1930s, among the Zaibatsu firms reaching as high as 40% of all outstanding stock during wartime. 30. This increased the independence of managers. as the new shareholders were other managers with the same growth orientation.
很快就发现，如果一个集团内的公司发行股票，并在彼此之间交换，就可以在不稀释集团关系的情况下减少外部股东的影响。因此，1930年代的交叉持股率上升，财阀公司在战时的所有未流通股票中高达40%。这增加了经理的独立性，因为新的股东是具有相同增长取向的其他经理。
The new labor system, creation of Japan as we know it.
新劳动制度塑造我们所知的日本。
Yet by 1943, the control bureaucrats and military felt that profit orientation of firms was still dominant and growth orientation insufficient. They found that managers were still afraid of shareholders. Although dividends had been reduced, shareholders could still threaten managers during general meetings. Thus, as part of the 1943 measures to strengthen the domestic system, the corporate law was changed and a new munitions corporation law was promulgated in October of that year. It eliminated shareholders' influence on firm management. Instead, the authorities designated one manager as the responsible person for production in every firm. He was given the power to run the firm as he saw fit to achieve the twin goals of quantity and quality. He could not be sacked by stockholders and was dispensed from the necessity to obtain stockholder permission for his actions. Point 31 He was only to be held accountable by the planning bureaucrats for the fulfillment of quantitative production objectives. The planners' powers were also strengthened when in November 1943 the Cabinet Planning Board was united with the Ministry of Commerce and Industry to form the powerful Munitions Ministry. Point 32.
然而，到了1943年，控制官僚和军方感觉到企业的利润导向仍然占主导地位，增长导向不足。他们发现经理们仍然害怕股东，尽管股息已经减少，但股东们仍然可以在股东大会上威胁经理。因此，作为1943年加强国内制度措施的一部分，公司法被修改，新的军需公司法在那年10月颁布。它消除了股东对公司管理的影响。相反，当局指定每个公司的一名经理作为生产的负责人，他被赋予了按照他认为合适的方式运营公司，以实现数量和质量双重目标的权利。他不能被股东解雇，也不需要获得股东对他的行动的许可。31他只需要对计划官僚负责，以实现定量生产目标。当在1943年11月内阁计划委员会与商业和工业部合并形成强大的军需部时，计划者的权力也得到了加强。32
In March 1944, the annual share dividend was decreased to 5%. Any residual influence by shareholders over profit allocation, fundraising matters, and the appointment of managers was eliminated. They had been reduced to fixed-income investors without a vote. The bulk of profits were divided among reinvestment, salaries for managers and employees, and special bonuses for workers to reward specific productivity improvements. Point 33.
1944年3月，年度股息降低到 5%， 股东对利润分配、筹资事项和经理人任命的任何剩余影响都被消除。他们已经被降级为没有投票权的固定收入投资者。利润的大部分被分配给在投资、经理和员工的薪水，以及奖励特定生产力提高的工人的特别奖金。33
Since managers had been given great powers, they had to be prevented from boosting their own bonuses too much. So managers and employees received salaries according to the number of years they had served in the firm, seniority pay. Promotion was to be decided on relative merit. If a firm grew fast, the less able manager could be promoted also. In return, employees and managers had to vow loyalty to the firm. They were effectively prevented from quitting, because other firms, organized on the same principles of seniority and lifetime employment, would not hire them.
由于经理们被赋予了巨大的权力，他们必须被阻止过度提高自己的奖金。因此，经理和员工的薪水是根据他们在公司服务的年数来决定的工龄工资。晋升是根据相对优势来决定的。如果一个公司发展迅速，能力较弱的经理也可能被提升。作为回报，员工和经理必须对公司表示忠诚。他们实际上被阻止了辞职，因为其他公司按照工龄和终身就业的原则组织不会雇佣他们。
Welfare schemes for managers and employees were introduced that were the most advanced in Asia. The National Health Insurance Law of 1938 and the Personnel Health Insurance Law of 1939 provided virtually complete health coverage to employees. The 1942 Workmen's Annuity and Insurance Law for the first time required the payment of annuities in case of old age, disability, or death. In 1944, it was broadened to include other personnel and women. 34.
为经理和员工引入了在亚洲最先进的福利计划。1938年的国民健康保险法和1939年的员工健康保险法为员工提供了几乎完全的健康保障。1942年的工人年金和保险法首次要求在老年、残疾或死亡的情况下支付年金。1944年，它被扩大到包括其他人员和妇女。34.
Creation of the main bank system.
创建主要银行系统。
Large-scale firms were the bureaucrats' friends. So several national policy firms were set up, which evolved into giant conglomerates. Most of them were stock companies, but the majority of the stocks were held by the government and shareholder influence was limited. The government chose the top managers, and bureaucrats oversaw company policy. The number of these firms jumped from 27 in 1937 to 154 in June 1941.35 in 1944. Key producers of military supplies were designated as munitions companies. In 1945, over 600 firms received necessary funds to fulfill their production quota via one or two banks that had been allocated to them by the Ministry of Finance. 36. This main bank was the designated financial institution authorized to finance munitions companies, ordered to ensure a steady flow of bank loans to the firm as it required, a compulsory lending system. The main bank relationships lasted until today.
大型企业是官僚的朋友，因此设立了几家国家政策公司，它们发展成为巨大的企业集团。它们中的大多数是股份公司，但大部分股份由政府持有，股东的影响力有限。政府选择顶级经理，官僚监督公司政策。这些公司的数量从1937年的27家增加到1941年6月的154家。35. 1944年，军需品的主要生产商被指定为军需公司。1945年，超过600家公司通过财政部为他们分配的1-2家银行获得了完成生产配额所需的资金。36这家主要银行被指定为负责为军需公司提供融资的金融机构，被要求确保公司需要时能够稳定地获得银行贷款，一种强制性的贷款系统。这种主要银行的关系一直持续到今天。
Banks were compensated against losses for risky lending, either through the government loan guarantee program or by being bailed out by the government if they got into trouble. In March 1945, the system was further expanded. Soon more than 2,000 firms, including many companies not involved with munitions, had each been assigned a bank charged with tending to their financing needs. The allocation of bank credit thus shifted drastically from other sectors to priority manufacturing. 37 and bank credit accounted for almost 100% of corporate fundraising by the end of the war. Funding through the stock market had ceased.
银行对风险贷款的损失得到了补偿，要么通过政府贷款担保计划，要么在他们陷入困境时由政府进行救助。1945年3月，这个系统进一步扩大。很快，超过2000家公司，包括许多与军火无关的公司，都被分配了一家负责照顾他们融资需求的银行。因此，银行信贷的分配从其他行业大幅转向优先制造业。37到战争结束时，银行信贷几乎占据了企业筹资的100%。通过股市的筹资已经停止。
The origin of Japan's high savings rate.
日本高储蓄率的起源。
As more and more purchasing power was given to the military producers, who then made claims on the limited resources, fewer goods and services were available for private consumption. If consumers were to spend as much as they had in the 1920s, they would compete with the military and bid up prices. Inflation would be the result, and that would threaten labor disputes and worker unrest, as it did in 1937 and earlier. The solution was to get the population to withhold their purchasing power by saving. This would prevent inflation.
随着越来越多的购买力被赋予军事生产者，他们对有限资源的索取使得私人消费的商品和服务变得更少。如果消费者像他们在20世纪20年代那样花费，他们将与军队竞争并推高价格。 结果将是通货膨胀，这将威胁到劳动纠纷和工人不满，就像1937年和更早的时候一样。解决方案是让人们通过储蓄来限制他们的购买力，这将防止通货膨胀。
The first step was to encourage voluntary savings. In April 1938, a national savings promotion campaign was launched that aimed at boosting the savings rate to 30% of GNP. Savings promotion committees and cooperatives mushroomed throughout government offices and private firms and among ordinary workers and neighborhoods throughout the country. An agency for the promotion of savings was established at the Bank of Japan, where it is still in operation today. Most of the savings took the form of deposits with the postal savings system or with banks. The result was underconsumption and a transfer of purchasing power from the household sector to the corporate sector.
第一步是鼓励自愿储蓄。1938年4月，启动了一项旨在将储蓄率提高到国民生产总值30%的全国储蓄促进运动。储蓄促进委员会和合作社在政府办公室、私营公司以及全国各地的普通工人和社区中如雨后春笋般涌现。日本银行设立了一个储蓄促进机构，至今仍在运营。大部分储蓄以邮政储蓄系统或银行存款的形式存在。结果是消费不足和购买力从家庭部门转移到企业部门。
Creation of the trade and business associations.
贸易和商业协会的创建。
In the new economic order, the visible hands of the mobilization planners directed resources from the top down by formulating quantitative output targets, which were then divided into the various industries and passed on to the control organizations that had been created in each industry. They exist until this day as the ubiquitous industry or trade associations. Thanks to the associations, the bureaucrats could delegate the task of implementation and monitoring of their orders to the private sector. It was the control associations, not bureaucrats, that divided overall quotas into orders for individual firms and ensured compliance. Human resources were allocated similarly, achieving a historic transfer of labor from agriculture and non-priority firms to munitions companies.
在新经济秩序中，动员规划者的可见之手，通过制定数量产出目标，从上至下地引导资源。这些目标然后被分配到各个行业，并传递给在每个行业中创建的控制组织。它们至今仍然存在，作为无处不在的行业或贸易协会。多亏了这些协会，官僚们可以将他们的命令的实施和监控任务委托给私营部门。是控制协会，而不是官僚，将总配额分解为个别公司的订单，并确保遵守。人力资源的分配也类似。实现了从农业和非优先公司到军火公司的劳动力的历史性转移。
To organize industry more efficiently, firms and factories were amalgamated into fewer, larger units that could enjoy economies of scale. The economic structure became highly concentrated. At the same time, the large firms found it efficient to subcontract production of certain components to smaller firms, who were dependent on them, virtual external subsidiaries.
为了更有效地组织行业，公司和工厂被合并成更少、更大的单位，以享受规模经济的优势。经济结构变得高度集中。同时，大公司发现将某些组件的生产分包给小公司是有效的，这些小公司依赖于他们，实际上是外部子公司。
The New Japan.
新日本。
The changes implemented between 1937 and 1945 reshaped the function of the firm. Under the slogan Public Interest Above Individual Interest, the new economic order successfully transformed firms from private profit-seeking undertakings to quasi-public ones focusing on growth, not profits. The market mechanism of the pre-war period was substituted by a system of planning and government guidance that used private property and rank competition as an incentive device. Import penetration was successfully reduced. 38 resources had been shifted from non-essential industries to the heavy machinery and manufacturing industries crucial for munitions. Textiles had from 29.3% of total production in 1937 to 14.7% in 1941. While the machinery production share more than doubled from 14.4% to 30.2%. 39 private sector savings rose from only 9.1% in the 1920s to 54.8% of GNP from 1941 to 1944.40. Real GDP grew by 25% during the war years, from 1940 to 1944. .41 Munitions production grew 197% between 1941 and 1944. .42 Labor was fully mobilized and shifted from agriculture to industry in a transformation that irreversibly rendered Japan an industrialized nation. .43 Unemployment had been eliminated. The planners of the war economy achieved the goal of maximizing output from the available resources.
1937年至1945年间实施的变革改变了公司的功能。在公众利益高于个人利益的口号下，新经济秩序成功地将公司从追求私人利润的企业转变为关注增长而非利润的准公共企业。战前的市场机制被一个使用私有财产和等级竞争作为激励手段的计划和政府指导系统所取代，成功地减少了进口渗透。38资源已经从非必需的行业转移到对军火生产至关重要的重型机械和制造业。1937年，纺织业占总产量的 29.3%， 到1941年减少到 14.7%， 而机械生产份额则从 14.4% 增加到 30.2%。39私人储蓄从20世纪20年代的 9.1% 增加到1941年至1944年的国民生产总值的 54.8%。40战争年代1940年至1944年，实际 GDP 增长了 25%。1941年至1944年间，军火生产增长了 197%。42劳动力得到了充分的动员，并从农业转向工业，这一转变使日本不可逆转地成为了一个工业化国家。43失业已经被消除。战争经济的规划者实现了从可用资源中最大化产出的目标。
Introduction of one-party rule.
引入一党制。
On the political front, the military and reform bureaucrats felt that a system had to be created that would keep meddling politicians at bay. For this purpose, political parties were simply abolished, and all politicians united in a one-party system, as pioneered by the Soviet Union. The single party was called the Imperial Rule Assistance Association. The police force was reorganized in an attempt to increase surveillance of individuals. A system of neighborhood police checkpoints was developed, which put up police microstations in virtually every corner of the country and enlisted senior citizens in each neighborhood as police informers. The system is intact today. Japan also became the most advanced social welfare state in Asia. Schooling was transformed, agriculture revamped. The changes were long-lasting. 44.
在政治方面，军队和改革官僚认为必须创建一个能够阻止政客干预的系统。为此，政党被简单的废除，所有政治家都在一个党的制度下团结起来。这种制度是由苏联首创的。这个单一的党被称为帝国统治援助协会。警察部队进行了重组，以增加对个人的监视。开发了一个邻里警察检查点的系统，几乎在全国每个角落设立了警察微型站，并在每个社区招募了老年人作为警察的告密者。这个系统至今仍在使用。日本也成为了亚洲最先进的社会福利国家。学校进行了改革，农业得到了重组。这些变化是长期的。44
Japan system, an economy at war.
日本的系统，战时经济。
By the time Japan surrendered in 1945, most key features of the post-war economic structure had been established, and Japan had been transformed from the free market capitalism of the 1920s to the controlled, Japanese style capitalism of the post-war era. The labor structure among large firms changed to low job mobility and high loyalty to the firm, lifetime employment, seniority system, company unions, and bonus pay. The corporate organization clearly separated ownership from control, allowed few outside board directors, left shareholders weak, and thus made low dividends and a growth orientation possible. A dual structure was created, characterized by a few large firms with many small subcontractors linked in business groups. Funding shifted to borrowing from banks. The role of the bureaucracy became more interventionist, and administrative guidance was crucial. Politicians did not make policies, and their influence was kept in check by the one-party system. The war mobilization changed what previously was a largely agrarian society into an industrial workforce trained to serve according to military work schedules.
到1945年日本投降时，战后经济结构的大部分关键特征已经确立， 日本已从20年代的自由市场资本主义转变为战后时期的受控的日本式资本主义。大公司的劳动结构变为了低流动性和对公司的高度忠诚、终身雇佣、长工制、公司工会和奖金支付。公司组织明确地将所有权与控制权分开，很少有外部董事，股东权力弱，因此可能产生低股息和增长导向。创建了一个双重结构，以少数大公司和许多小型分包商组成的商业集团为特征。资金转向了从银行借款。官僚机构的角色变得更加干预主义，行政指导至关重要。政治家并未制定政策，他们的影响力被一党制所制约。战争动员将原本以农业为主的社会转变为按照军事工作时间表服务的工业劳动力。
The sudden emergence of the war economy system in the short time from 1937 to 1945 should surprise economists and historians. First, the system itself is surprisingly consistent, logically coherent, and highly efficient. Taking one individual component alone, it would not work. Implemented in its entirety, as happened in the post-war era, it beat the free market system of other countries hands down and created the post-war Japanese economic miracle.
从1937年到1945年短时间内，战争经济体系的突然出现，应该会让经济学家和历史学家感到惊讶。首先，这个体系本身令人惊讶的一致，逻辑连贯，效率极高。单独取出一个组成部分，它将无法运作。但是，像战后时期那样完全实施，它击败了其他国家的自由市场体系，创造了战后日本的经济奇迹。
How could the wartime planners so quickly design such a consistent and efficient system? They had gained invaluable experience in implementing and running this system when they were experimenting with its prototype in Manchuria, which had been under direct army rule since 1931. The same bureaucrats then moved back to Japan to implement it there. The Manchurian planners did not have to invent it from scratch, either. They took most of their ideas from European thinkers and economists, with the biggest input coming from Germany. 45.
战时规划者如何能如此迅速地设计出如此一致和高效的系统呢？他们在实施和运行这个系统时，从1931年开始，直接由军队统治的满洲的原型实验中获得了宝贵的经验。然后，同样的官僚们回到日本，在那里实施它。满洲的规划者也不需要从零开始发明它，他们从欧洲思想家和经济学家那里获取了大部分的想法，最大的贡献来自德国。45